What began as a simple act of pity to save an orphan and her foal would become the foundation of a family as unlikely as it was powerful, forever changing the destiny of the three. The compassion that unites destinies is one of the most beautiful forces that exist. If the beginning of this journey has already touched you, show your support in the comments and consider subscribing to find out what the future held for this new family. The dust of the corral rose with the heat, thick and suffocating, clinging to the skin like an omen. Ramiro, the foreman, advanced slowly, a leather whip hanging from his hand, his eyes fixed not on the girl, but on the foal cowering behind her. The animal, still clumsy on its long legs, trembled, sensing the hostility emanating from the man. There, standing like a statue carved from dust and pain, was Taini. Her face was a mask of silence, but her dark, deep eyes burned with an ancestral fury that belied her thin and fragile body. In her small hand, a sharp stone was clenched with such force that her knuckles were white. The air vibrated with the imminence of violence, a fragile sanctuary about to be desecrated under the relentless Chihuahua sun. Before the tip of the whip could even hiss through the air, Taini exploded into motion. There was no scream, only the silent speed of a predator defending its young. She lunged forward, the stone raised, the spirit of countless Chiricahua warriors awakening in that traumatized child's body. The confrontation seemed inevitable, a clash of hatred and desperation, but at the crucial moment, a shadow interposed. Joaquín, the rancher, moved with a surprising swiftness for a man of his age, his body becoming a living wall between his foreman and the girl. He did not reprimand Ramiro. His tired eyes, filled with an ancient sadness, met Taini's, and in that silent gaze he reaffirmed the promise that had sealed all their fates. He had sworn to give them a home, and that corral was now sacred ground. But to understand how we got to this point, we need to go back in time. Weeks earlier, the scene was different. It wasn't the dust of a corral that hung in the air, but the acrid smoke of a massacre. Joaquín wasn't looking for trouble, just a heifer that had strayed from the herd. But what he found was a small Chiricahua camp reduced to ashes and silence. Bodies lay where they had fallen, mute witnesses to brutal violence. And there, hidden under the remains of a burnt wagon, he found her. Taini was not crying. She just watched, her eyes empty like a child who had already seen the end of her world, clutching a piece of fabric that had belonged to her mother. It was nearby, next to the body of a slain mare, that the foal huddled, trembling with hunger and fear. Joaquín approached the girl slowly, offering her water from his canteen, a gesture of peace amidst the desolation. She ignored him at first, her gaze fixed on the small animal. It was the first time he heard her. A voice, a hoarse whisper that barely cut through the silence of death. "The foal is an orphan like me," she cried, the tears finally breaking through the dam of her shock. Looking from the devastated girl to the equally lost creature, Joaquín felt the weight of a responsibility he could not ignore. He made a vow, not just to her, but to himself. "Then you both will have a home with me." The journey back to the ranch was a long procession of silence, broken only by the sound of hooves in the dry, desert wind. Taini did not ride. She walked beside the foal, a small, steady hand on its flank, as if her presence was the only thing keeping it upright. Joaquín watched them from the corner of his eye, respecting the distance she imposed. He understood that trust could not be demanded, only earned, and that his promise was just the first seed planted in a stony soil of pain. At every stop, he offered her food and water, which she accepted without a word, her eyes always on the foal. Caring for. The animal became her sole purpose, a sacred ritual that anchored her to life. She found herbs for it, cleaned its coat with a piece of cloth, and whispered in her native tongue words that Joaquín did not understand, but whose tone of tenderness was universal. The arrival at Rancho de la Sombra was not a celebration. The cowboys stopped their chores, their faces a mixture of curiosity and sun-hardened distrust. An Apache girl and a scrawny foal were not the kind of addition they expected. Ramiro's gaze in particular was the harshest, a cold assessment that dismissed them as a useless burden. Joaquín's order, however, was clear and unquestionable. The girl and the animal were under his protection, and they would have what they needed. Ignoring the murmurs and hostile glares, Taini took refuge with the foal in the most distant corral, a space of packed earth and wooden fences that became her small territory. There, away from the others, she began to weave the threads of a world, a fragile sanctuary that weeks later Ramiro would try to violate. The dust settled slowly. The silence that followed Ramiro's departure was heavier than the midday heat. The foreman did not argue, just gave Joaquín a look of restrained insubordination before spitting on the ground and walking away, his whip dragging uselessly in the dirt. To him, the order was an absurdity, a weakness that would contaminate the ranch. But the authority in Joaquín's voice, though low and tired, was as unshakable as the mountains surrounding the valley. Taini remained motionless for a long moment, her body still tense, her eyes following Ramiro's figure until he disappeared behind the stable. Only then did her fingers unclench, and the sharp stone fell into the dust with a dull thud. The fury in her eyes gave way to a deep exhaustion, the adrenaline of survival draining away and leaving behind only the familiar pain. Joaquín didn't move, giving her the space she needed. He watched as she turned to the foal, her small, trembling hand stroking the animal's neck, whispering soft words in the Chiricahua language. That gesture, so full of tenderness amidst the brutality of the world, was the strongest thing he had ever seen. "He's going to be fine," Joaquín said, his voice breaking the silence. "I'll bring a mix of grains and milk. It will make him a champion." He didn't expect a response, and he didn't get one. But as he turned to go, he saw it. For the first time since he had found her, Taini looked at him, not at the foal or the horizon. It was a quick, fleeting glance, but in it there wasn't just the fear of a cornered prey. There was a question, fragile and silent, the first crack in the stone wall she had built around her heart. This fragile seed of trust, planted amid so much pain, reminds us of the power of empathy. If you also believe that a gesture of kindness can change everything, leave your support for Taini in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Thank you for listening and for being a part of this story. Joaquín kept his word. He returned minutes later, not empty-handed, but carrying a wooden bucket from which a porridge of oats and goat's milk exuded a gentle steam. He didn't get too close, aware that any false step could rebuild the wall that had just been cracked. He placed the bucket on the ground at a safe distance and stepped back, a silent invitation. Taini watched his every move, her dark eyes, assessing the intention behind the gesture. It was the foal, driven by instinct and hunger, that took the first step, its muzzle dipping eagerly into the mixture. Only then did Taini kneel beside it, her hand running along the animal's back, a gesture of permission and protection as she watched it feed. This became a ritual. Every morning and late afternoon, Joaquín would arrive with the bucket, a silent tribute to his promise. He never tried to force a conversation, sometimes just leaning against the fence and watching the sun go down behind the mountains, sharing the silence with her. Under Taini's care, the foal, which she came to call Sombra in her language, began to gain strength. Its thin coat gained a shine, and its clumsy legs found a new firmness. To Taini, he was more than an animal. He was the last fragment of her old world and the first anchor in the new one. Outside that corral, however, the ranch continued to be a hostile territory, the sideways glances of the other. Cowboys followed her like wasps, and the silence that fell when she passed was a wall as solid as the corral fences. She was an outsider, a Chiricahua ghost, in a world that saw her only as a problem. Ramiro's influence was like a weed, spreading silently across the ranch. The other cowboys, seeing the foreman's attitude, adopted a policy of passive hostility. Tools Taini tried to use would mysteriously disappear. The water bucket she filled for Sombra was often found overturned. If she approached the kitchen in search of scraps, conversations would cease and backs would turn to her. It wasn't open violence, which Joaquín could punish, but a campaign of 1,000 small cuts designed to make her feel invisible and unwanted. But Taini did not break. She learned to move in the shadows, to observe the rhythms of the ranch from afar, her senses sharpened by the need to survive in enemy territory. She became an expert at finding what she needed, at anticipating malice, her resilience forged in the fire of loss becoming a silent armor. Joaquín saw everything. He saw the petty cruelty of his men and the defiant dignity of the girl. He knew that words would not change hardened hearts, so he chose to act. One afternoon, as the sky was tinged with orange and Taini was brushing Sombra's coat, who now ran through the corral with a newfound energy, Joaquín approached. He wasn't carrying the bucket of porridge, but a small object wrapped in leather. He extended his hand and placed it on the fence post without saying a word. Taini stopped, suspicious, her eyes fixed on him. With a nod, he encouraged her to take it. Inside the leather was a small knife, its blade polished and sharp, the wooden handle smooth and worn with use. "Every warrior needs a good blade," he said, his voice low. For the first time, Taini's lips curved into something that could almost be a smile. She said nothing, but took the knife, its weight in her hand feeling right, familiar. It was more than a tool, it was a recognition. He didn't see her as a victim, but as the survivor she was. The knife did not sit idle. In the long, silent hours when the sun beat down on the land, Taini would sit in the shade of the corral fence, the blade moving with a dexterity that seemed innate. She didn't carve for a pastime. It was a form of prayer, an act of memory. From small, discarded pieces of wood, she created tiny figures, a bison, an eagle, the symbols of her people. Her most dedicated project, however, was a small horse, whose lines she refined day after day, trying to capture the wild soul of Sombra in the dead wood. Joaquín watched her from a distance, amazed at the concentration and skill contained in that small body. Ramiro and the others, however, saw something different. To them, the knife in the Apache girl's hand was not a tool of creation, but a weapon in waiting, a reminder of her wild nature, and the fear they felt only deepened the abyss between them. The months unfolded in the dust, transforming the foal into a young horse with a dark, shiny coat and an energy that seemed to spark from its hooves. Sombra was no longer the trembling creature that had arrived at the ranch. He was a promise of speed and strength, loyal only to the girl who whispered in his ear. The day came when Joaquín, with a look that mixed pride and concern, declared it was time to start breaking him. Ramiro's reaction was immediate and dismissive. "Break that thing?" he scoffed, gesturing towards the corral. "That's not a horse. It's a wild beast with Apache blood. It'll kill the first man who tries to ride it." Before Joaquín could answer, a clear, firm voice cut through the air. "No man will ride him." Taini stepped out of the stable shadow, her eyes fixed on Ramiro with an icy challenge. "I will break him." A harsh laugh, like gravel being ground, came from Ramiro and was soon echoed by some of the other cowboys. The idea was as absurd to them as a coyote. "Preaching a sermon." "You?" the foreman sneered, contempt dripping from every syllable. "A child is going to break that demon. He'll break your bones before you even touch his coat." The men crowded around the corral fence, an audience thirsty for a spectacle of failure. But Joaquín did not laugh. His eyes went from Taini's determined face to Sombra's imposing figure, and he saw what the others could not. A bond, forged not in rope and leather, but in shared pain and survival. He raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Let her." The order was final. Turning to Taini, his gaze was a mixture of faith and apprehension. "Show them, girl. Show them all." Taini paid them no attention. To her, the men at the fence were just part of the dusty, irrelevant landscape. She slipped between the wooden logs and entered the corral, moving not with the arrogance of a horsebreaker, but with the quietness of one entering a sacred place. Sombra, sensing the tension in the air, reared and neighed, his front hooves pawing the ground. The cowboys instinctively backed away, but Taini did not hesitate. She began to speak to him in Chiricahua, her voice low and melodic, an ancient song that spoke of rivers and winds and the freedom of the plains. Slowly, the horse calmed down, his ears turned towards the source of that familiar sound. She did not rope him. She just walked up to him, extended her hand, and stroked his muscular neck. Then, in a fluid and effortless motion, as if she had been doing it her whole life, she pushed herself up and mounted his bare back. Sombra shuddered, but did not bolt. There, under the incredulous gaze of everyone, the girl and the horse remained as one, a living statue of trust and defiance. The silence that followed was the most resounding of defeats for Ramiro, and the most profound of victories for the orphan and her horse. The silence was broken not by applause, but by the grinding of Ramiro's teeth. "This proves nothing," he growled, his voice low and full of venom, refusing to accept the evidence before his eyes. "It's a savage's trick. Let her put a saddle on it, and we'll see the demon it really is." In response, Taini said not a word. She just leaned forward, a whisper escaping her lips. Sombra responded instantly. What began as a hesitant step turned into a gentle trot, and then into a controlled gallop around the corral's perimeter. There was no fight, no resistance. They were like a single creature, a centaur born of the desert, moving with a grace the cowboys had never seen. Every lap was another nail in the coffin of Ramiro's pride. Joaquín watched, a rare and genuine smile touching his tired lips. When Taini finally stopped the horse in the center of the corral, as still as before, Joaquín turned to his foreman. "I think the discussion is over, Ramiro." The public humiliation did not extinguish Ramiro's hatred. It only made it burn deeper, turning it into a dangerous ember, waiting for the right moment to set everything on fire. He walked away without another word, but the look he cast over his shoulder at Taini was a promise of retribution. The dynamic at Rancho de la Sombra had changed forever. The mockery from the other cowboys disappeared, replaced by a cautious silence, a mix of awe and fear. The Apache girl was no longer just a burden. She was an enigma, a holder of a power they did not understand and therefore feared. Taini felt the change. The looks that followed her were no longer of contempt, but of apprehensive curiosity. She had conquered her territory, not with a knife or a stone, but with a demonstration of spirit that none of them could match. And every day at dawn, she and Sombra would leave the corral, riding through the vast lands of the ranch. Together, they became a whispered legend, a dark and swift speck against the rising sun, a living reminder that the wildest things cannot always be broken. Taini and Sombra's morning rides became a ritual, a silent dance with the desert. She did not ride aimlessly. She explored. Instinct, honed by generations of ancestors who lived and died on that land, guided her. She didn't just see the landscape, she read it. She read the coyote tracks in the sand, the disturbance of birds that betrayed a predator's presence, the places where water hid beneath the parched surface. Joaquín observed this, not with the surprise of a stranger, but with the recognition of a man who understood the land. The pity he had felt at the beginning had transformed into a deep respect. One day, at dusk, as Taini was tending to Sombra, he approached with a seriousness she had never seen in him. "The ranch needs sharp eyes on the ridges, Taini," he said. "Someone who can see danger before it arrives." Find the cattle that get lost in the storm. I want you to be those eyes. Joaquín's decision struck the bunkhouse like a lightning bolt. Ramiro, whose authority as foreman and main scout had been publicly challenged, could barely contain his fury. "Trust our herd to an Apache?" he would hiss to the other men during nights fueled by cheap tequila. "She'll lead them straight into an ambush by her relatives." The venom of his words found fertile ground in the prejudice of the others. The hostility, once passive, became something darker and more foreboding. It was then that the real test arrived, not from the hands of men, but from the claws of nature. A mountain lion, large and cunning, began to haunt the farthest pastures, leaving behind a trail of calves with torn throats and half-eaten carcasses. Ramiro's best scouts returned empty-handed day after day, their frustration eroding their arrogance. It was then, in a tense meeting on the porch of the main house, that all eyes, filled with doubt and a hint of desperate hope, turned to the silent figure in the corner, Taini. Joaquín let the silence stretch, forcing each man to face his own impotence. Then his voice sounded, not as a command, but as a statement of fact. "Ramiro, your men have found nothing. The girl reads the land in a way we have forgotten." He turned to Taini, his gaze not that of a boss to an employee, but of an elder to a warrior. "Can you find him, Taini?" Ramiro let out a scornful laugh. "You're going to send the child to her death? Great, but she goes alone. I won't risk my men following an Apache mirage." Taini did not deign to look at the foreman. Her dark eyes met Joaquín's, and in a silence that weighed more than any words, she gave a single, slow nod. Without waiting for further discussion, she turned and walked towards the corral, her small silhouette moving with a determination that silenced everyone. Before the first ray of sun touched the valley floor, Taini and Sombra were already one with the dawn shadows. There was no noise from a hunting party, only the muffled sound of hooves on the damp earth and the whisper of the wind among the rocks. She didn't just look for tracks, as the others had done. She read the secret language of that place, the way a flock of quail burst from a bush, the sudden silence of the crickets, the tension in the air that only a predator at the top of the food chain could create. She guided Sombra through narrow passages between the rocks that the other cowboys, with their haste and noise, had ignored, and it was there, in a crevice sheltered from the wind, that she found what she was looking for. Not a fresh carcass, but the old, clean bones of a wild sheep, and beside them, the unmistakable scratch of sharp claws on the rock. She had found the lion's den. She did not act with the haste of a hunter, but with the patience of the stone itself. For hours, she remained motionless, watching the den from a distance, feeling the rhythm of the day change, the sun moving across the sky, the wind shifting direction. Sombra was restless beneath her, but a soft touch on his neck was enough to calm him. The silence was broken by an almost imperceptible movement. The great cat emerged, not as a fierce beast, but as a golden spectre gliding over the rocks, its body a ripple of muscle and contained power. He stopped, his muzzle raised, testing the air. His eyes, the color of molten amber, met Taini's. There was no growl, no challenge, just a silent acknowledgement between two solitary predators. Taini did not reach for her knife. Instead, she dismounted slowly, gathered a handful of dried herbs and sagebrush from her bag, and with a flint lit a small flame. Feeding it carefully, she created a dense, acrid smoke, letting the wind, which now blew towards the den, carry it. It was not an attack, it was a message. This territory is no longer safe. Your hunt is over. The lion watched the smoke approach, instinct older than the mountains warning it. With one last look at the small figure claiming the valley, it turned and disappeared into the highlands, a ghost retreating to its kingdom. Taini's return to the ranch was as silent as her departure. She appeared with the first light, a solitary silhouette against the pale pink sky. The cowboys, led by Ramiro, were already waiting for her, their faces a canvas of skepticism and malicious expectation. "So, The great hunter returns empty-handed, Ramiro sneered, his voice loud for all to hear. Ran at the first sign of danger, just like I said. Taini did not reply. She dismounted from Sombra and walked through the men, who reluctantly made way. She stopped before Joaquín, who was waiting for her on the porch. Without a word, she opened her small, soot-stained hand. In her palm, there was no ear or tooth as a trophy, but a tuft of lion-colored fur and the broken tip of a claw, which she had found embedded in the rock near the den. "He will not return to the valleys," she said, her voice low but laden with the weight of truth. Joaquín looked at the proof, then at the girl's impassive face, and nodded slowly. The fury on Ramiro's face upon realizing she had won on her own terms without shedding blood was more eloquent than any shout. The war for Rancho de la Sombra was not over. It had just chosen its true champion. Joaquín's order, delivered in the quiet of the morning, sealed the new balance of power. "From today on," he announced to the assembled men, "the security of the high pastures and the watch against predators and rustlers are in Taini's hands. Her word on the land is mine." It was not a request. It was a decree. The authority, once belonging to Ramiro by right and force, had been transferred to the girl they had despised. A murmur ran through the cowboys, a mixture of disbelief and a new, reluctant respect. Ramiro said nothing. He remained motionless, his hand gripping the handle of his whip so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes, however, followed Taini's figure as she led Sombra to drink water, and in them there was no defeat, but the venomous glint of a snake waiting for the exact moment to strike. He had lost a battle, but the war, for him, was far from over. That night, the air in the bunkhouse was heavy with the smell of tequila and resentment. Ramiro didn't have to shout to be heard. His voice was a conspiratorial whisper, planting seeds of fear and superstition. "That wasn't natural," he hissed to the two men most loyal to him, their faces lit by the flickering flame of a lantern. "It's Apache witchcraft. She talks to the animals. She commands them. That horse isn't a horse. It's her spirit. As long as that beast is standing, her savagery will have power over this place." He leaned closer, the plan forming in his eyes like a dark storm. An accident can happen in the high pastures. An animal can slip in a ravine, break a leg. Without her horse, she's nothing. Just a scared child in the desert. And then we'll see who really runs Rancho de la Sombra. The plan was not long in materializing. Under the cloak of a moonless darkness, the two cowboys most loyal to Ramiro rode to the ridges, their faces dark and determined. They chose a narrow pass, a shortcut Taini often used to save time, flanked by a rocky slope. There, they stretched a thick, sturdy lariat rope, tied tightly between two rocks and positioned at the exact height to entangle the front legs of a galloping horse. It was not a work of strength, but of calculated malice. Once the trap was set, they retreated as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind an almost invisible thread of danger, humming low with the tension of its promise of violence. The dawn arrived with its cold, clean breath. As on every other morning, Taini and Sombra were a single, swift shadow cutting through the sleeping landscape. The gallop was a familiar rhythm, the wind a whisper in her ears. As they approached the rocky shortcut, Sombra did not hesitate, trusting the trail he knew so well. It was then that the animal's instinct, sharper than any human sense, screamed danger. In mid-stride, Sombra reared violently, neighing in alarm and nearly overbalancing backwards, his hooves digging into the earth mere inches from the rope. Taini, thrown forward by the jolt, clung to his mane, her heart pounding not with fear but with a sudden, icy understanding. Calming the trembling horse with her voice and touch, she slid to the ground. Her eyes scanned the trail and found the dark, unnatural line. She knelt, her fingers tracing the taut rope, feeling the roughness of the knot that secured it to the rock. There was no doubt. The sanctuary had been desecrated. Standing up, She did not look back towards the ranch, but to the horizon, her face a mask of stone. The fire of ancestral fury, which Joaquín had seen in the corral, now burned with a purpose as cold and sharp as the blade of the knife she carried. Taini did not cut the rope. With the patience of someone untangling a knot in a fishing line, she undid the tie on the rock, her small, nimble fingers working with a deadly calm. The rising sun cast long shadows through the canyon as she coiled the lariat rope, feeling the rough texture and the familiar smell of leather and horse sweat. She stored it, a sleeping serpent, in her bag. Then her eyes lowered to the ground. There, overlapping Sombra's tracks from the previous morning, were those of two other horses, shod with the same pattern used at the ranch. She did not follow the tracks. Instead, she mounted Sombra and continued her patrol, completing the round Joaquín had entrusted to her. Every sheep counted, every stretch of fence checked, was an act of silent defiance. She was not a victim fleeing a threat. She was the guardian of this territory, and the attack was not just against her, but against the order she represented. When Taini returned to the ranch, the sun was already high, and the cowboys were gathering near the well, preparing for the day's tasks. Ramiro was in the center of them, his voice loud and arrogant as he gave out orders. Taini guided Sombra to the middle of the yard, and silence spread like an oil slick on water. With a fluid movement, she pulled the rope from her bag and let it fall in the dust between her and the men. The dull thud was the only thing heard. Her eyes, dark as polished obsidian, did not fix on Ramiro, but on the two men beside him, whose faces suddenly turned pale. One of them took an involuntary step back. The other could not look away from the rope on the ground. It was then that Joaquín came out of the main house, his breakfast interrupted by the sudden quiet. His eyes went from the girl to the rope on the ground, to the guilty faces of his men, and finally to the poorly disguised fury of his foreman. Not a word had been spoken, but the accusation and the verdict already hung, heavy and irrefutable, under the Chihuahua sun. The silence was broken by Joaquín's deep, tired voice. He did not look at Ramiro, but at the two men sweating coldly beside the foreman. "Whose rope is this?" he asked, the question dropping like a stone in a well. Ramiro stepped forward, a sneer on his lips. "It's just a lariat, boss, probably lost by some careless—" But Joaquín raised a hand, silencing him without even a glance. "I wasn't talking to you, Ramiro." His eyes remained fixed on the two cowboys. "I'll ask one more time. Whose rope is this?" One of them, a young man named Miguel, could not bear the weight of that gaze and lowered his head, a gesture that was a full confession. Joaquín nodded slowly. "Miguel, Pedro, get your things. I want you off my ranch before sunset." There was no appeal, no argument. The two men turned, walking with their shoulders slumped under the weight of shame and exile, the silence of the other cowboys following them like a shroud. With the men dismissed, Joaquín finally turned to his foreman. The yard seemed vast and empty now, containing only the tension among the three of them. "I can't prove the order came from you, Ramiro," Joaquín said, his voice dangerously low. "But listen well. If a single hair on her head or on that horse is touched, if a stone rolls onto their path by accident, there won't be a desert big enough for you to hide from me." It wasn't a threat from a boss to an employee. It was the vow of one man to another. Ramiro did not answer. He just stood there, his face a mask of controlled hatred, while Taini, still silent, took Sombra's reins and led him to the water trough, passing the foreman as if he were just another shadow the morning sun would soon make disappear. But they both knew that shadow would not disappear. It would only wait for nightfall. The peace that settled over Rancho de la Sombra in the following days was a poisonous peace, the tense calm before a summer storm. Ramiro carried out his duties with a mechanical obedience, his fury simmering beneath a surface of apathy. He stopped shouting orders and started whispering poison, undermining the other cowboys' trust in Joaquín with comments about the boss's age and his weakness for a savage. Taini, for her part, ignored the charged atmosphere. Her routine did not change. She and Sombra continued to be the silent guardians of the ranch, their presence on the ridges a promise of vigilance. Her bond with Joaquín deepened, not in words, but in gestures. A nod at dawn, an extra bowl of stew left for her on the kitchen doorstep, a shared look of understanding over the corral fences. They were the two pillars supporting that fragile world, a tired old rancher and an orphan girl, united against the darkness that refused to yield. Ramiro's attack, when it came, was not with the speed of a whip, but with the slowness of a drought. The cattle in the northern pastures began to fall ill. First, an unexplained weakness, then a thirst that the water from the troughs could not seem to quench. Joaquín and the other cowboys found the water muddy and bitter-tasting, but they couldn't find the source of the contamination. Ramiro, feigning concern, sent men on useless searches downstream, knowing the answer lay in the opposite direction. It was Taini who realized the truth. She didn't see the contamination in the water, but in the land. She saw the birds' migration patterns change, noticed that the coyotes avoided that stream, smelled the unnatural scent of decay that the wind carried from the springs in the mountains. While the men searched for a dead animal in the stream, Taini knew this was the work of a different poison, one planted by human hands. At dusk, without a word to anyone, she mounted Sombra and rode north, following the stream bed towards the source of the poison. The darkness did not slow her. Sombra moved with the confidence of a ghost over the rocky terrain, guided more by trust in his rider than by sight. The smell of decay grew stronger, but mixed with something else, a chemical bitter odor that did not belong in that place. The stream narrowed to a trickle of water running between the stones, leading Taini to its source, a small grotto where water sprang from the earth. There, the smell was suffocating. Pieces of crushed branches and leaves of desert oleander, a plant Taini knew well for its lethal poison, were piled at the mouth of the spring, its milky, toxic sap contaminating the valley's life source. It was deliberate and cruel sabotage. As she examined the scene, a metallic glint in the faint moonlight caught her attention. Stuck in the mud beside a deep boot print was a small silver concho with an intricate design of a coiled serpent. She recognized it instantly. It was the ornament that fastened the strap of Ramiro's holster. Taini picked up the small metal disc, the cold of the silver in her hand feeling like the cold of justice itself. She returned with the sun, finding the men exactly as she had left them, an anxious and exhausted group gathered near the main house. The tension was palpable. Taini dismounted and walked directly to Joaquín, ignoring the stares and murmurs. Before the rancher, she opened her hand. First, she dropped a handful of the crushed oleander leaves, whose acrid smell rose in the morning air. Then, she placed the silver concho on top of them. The last trace of patience in Joaquín's eyes turned to cold steel. He took the concho, his gaze fixed on his foreman. "You poisoned my land, Ramiro," he said, his voice low but resonating with the final authority of a judge. Ramiro laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "A savage's word against mine? She planted it." Joaquín held up the small piece of silver. "This fell from your holster? I gave it to you myself for Christmas 2 years ago." The denial died on Ramiro's lips, replaced by the look of a cornered animal. In a swift, desperate move, Ramiro's hand went not for a horse or a whip, but for the large hunting knife on his belt. There were no more words. With a guttural roar of pure hatred, he lunged, not at Joaquín, but at the cause of his ruin, Taini. The blade flashed in the sun, a promise of final violence. Joaquín shouted, his aged body moving with desperate slowness to intervene. But before the blade could find its target, an older, more elemental fury exploded in the yard. Sombra, who had been tense beside Taini, reared up with a neigh that tore the air and crashed down with his front hooves on the advancing man. The attack was of shocking speed and brutality, a horrific sound of breaking bones and the dull thud of a heavy body falling into the dust. Sombra, the horse he had called a demon, stood over him, front hooves planted on the ground beside. His broken body, a black guardian snorting in protective fury. Taini did not flinch. She just watched, her hand resting on her horse's trembling flank, her face as impassive as the mountains that witnessed the scene. The spell was broken. The yard, once paralyzed, filled again with sound and movement. No man moved to help Ramiro, who lay groaning in the dust, the knife fallen inches from his limp hand. Instead, two of the older cowboys went to Joaquín, as if to reaffirm their loyalty to the true leader. "Get him out of here," Joaquín said, his voice devoid of any emotion except a deep weariness. "Leave him on the road to town. What happens to him after that is no longer our concern." As the men silently carried out the order, hauling away the defeated foreman, Joaquín approached Taini. She was calming Sombra with soft whispers, the animal still trembling with the adrenaline of its fury. The old rancher said nothing. He just placed a heavy, trembling hand on the girl's shoulder. In that touch, everything was said. The ranch had a new guardian. The promise made over ashes and pain had finally blossomed under the relentless Chihuahua sun, not just as a home, but as a kingdom. The dust settled, but the dark stain in the yard remained like a scar. In the days that followed, a different quiet settled over Rancho de la Sombra. It was not the tense silence of hostility, but the silence of respect. The cowboys, who once looked away in contempt, now did so in deference. When Taini passed, they made way. Her questions about the cattle or the fences were answered with a seriousness she had never before been granted. She did not change. She remained a creature of few words, preferring the company of Sombra and the vast silence of the desert. But something in her posture had solidified. She no longer moved along the edges of the ranch like a ghost, but occupied its center with the silent authority of a queen in her own domain. The seasons changed, and the fierce heat of summer gave way to the cooler winds of autumn. Taini and Sombra were no longer just a whispered legend, but the backbone of the ranch. Under her watch, the herd thrived. She found pastures the other men had never known, sensed the arrival of a storm in the changing winds, and guided the cattle to the safety of the canyons before the first drop of rain fell. Joaquín watched her from the porch, his pipe unlit in his hand, and saw more than the fulfillment of a promise. He saw the spirit of that. Untamable land embodied in a girl and her horse. They had arrived as orphans, seeking a sanctuary, and in the process of defending it, they had become its soul. The way they became the soul of this place is proof that even the deepest wounds can give rise to the most extraordinary strength. If you believe in the power of this transformation, leave your support in the comments and subscribe to continue riding with us on this journey. Thank you for listening and for being part of this story. We'll see you in the next chapter.